Blood was still drying under her fingernails when the FBI kicked in the clubhouse door. She had just traded the only man who ever truly loved her for a brother she swore to protect. But the worst part of betrayal isn't the guilt. It's finding out you destroyed everything for a lie. The neon sign of the Bakersfield Memorial Hospital emergency room flickered in the relentless November rain, casting a sickly red glow across the wet pavement. Sarah Hayes was on hour 14 of a grueling 12-hour shift. At 28, she had seen enough gunshot wounds, overdoses, and shattered femurs to numb her to the chaos of Friday nights in California's Central Valley. She was a woman who kept her head down, worked hard, and carried a heavy cross, her younger brother, Tommy. Tommy was the only family Sarah had left. He was also a black hole of bad decisions, gambling debts, and whispered promises of, "This is the last time, Sarah, I swear." At 2:15 a.m., the ER doors blew open, and the chaos shifted from a low hum to a deafening roar. 4 massive men in heavy leather cooties barged into the trauma bay. The stench of motor oil, stale tobacco, and fresh coppery blood filled the sterile air. On the back of their vests, the iconic winged death head stared out beneath the arched top rocker. Hell's Angels. The bottom rocker read California. At the center of the imposing group was Jackson Cole. He was the president of the local charter, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, nervous tones by the local beat cops. He was 6'3" of scarred muscle, intricate ink, and cold, calculating authority. But right now his right hand was clamped over his left ribs, blood seeping through his fingers and dripping steadily onto the pristine white linoleum. "We need a doctor, now," one of the men, a heavily bearded biker whose patch read Sergeant at Arms, barked at the triage desk. The attending physician froze, visibly intimidated. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a trauma kit and stepped directly into the circle of giants. "Get him on bed 3. Move," she ordered, her voice cutting through the testosterone and panic. Jackson locked eyes with her as his brothers helped him onto the gurney. His eyes were a striking, piercing grey, unnervingly calm for a man who had just taken a knife to the ribs. "You always order men around like that, darling," Jackson grunted, wincing as Sarah unzipped his leather vest and carefully cut away his blood-soaked t-shirt. "Only the ones bleeding all over my floor," Sarah replied evenly, pressing a thick gauze pad against the laceration. It was a deep slice, missing the lung by a fraction of an inch. "You're lucky. A 1/4 inch deeper, and you'd be blowing bloody bubbles." "I make my own luck," Jackson murmured, his gaze never leaving her face. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah stitched him up. Against hospital protocol, and under the silent, intimidating stares of the 3 bikers standing guard at the door, she managed to keep the police out of the room. Jackson claimed it was a garage accident with a piece of sheet metal. Sarah didn't ask questions. She knew the rules of the streets better than most. When he finally sat up, buttoning a clean shirt one of his men had brought, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills. He tossed it onto the metal medical tray. "For your trouble," Jackson said, "and for keeping the cops out of my face." "I'm a nurse, not a mercenary," Sarah said, sliding the money back toward him. "Keep it. Just don't come back bleeding on my shift." Jackson paused, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He didn't take the money back. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I owe you one, Sarah Hayes." He had read her name tag. A shiver ran down her spine as he turned and walked out, his boots echoing heavily down the corridor, his brothers flanking him like a royal guard. For 3 weeks, Sarah tried to forget the grey-eyed outlaw. But the streets of Bakersfield were small, and the shadow of the Hells Angels was large. He started showing up at the diner where she grabbed coffee before her shifts. At first it was just a nod from a corner booth, then a cup of coffee waiting for her. Eventually, Jackson slid into the booth opposite her. Beneath the leather and the terrifying reputation, Sarah found a man who was fiercely loyal, surprisingly well-read, and exhaustingly protective. He treated her not like a badge of honor, but like something fragile and precious that he was terrified of breaking. Against every survival instinct she possessed, Sarah began falling in love with Jackson Cole. But her fragile bubble of happiness was violently punctured on a Tuesday morning. Sarah returned to her cramped apartment to find her front door kicked off its hinges. The living room was trashed. Furniture was overturned, lamps shattered, and the walls were smeared with a terrifying message written in what looked like motor oil. Time is up. Cowering in the corner of the kitchen, clutching a baseball bat with trembling hands, was Tommy. His face was a mess of purple bruises, his lip split open, and his left eye swollen shut. "Tommy! Oh my God!" Sarah dropped her bag and rushed to him, falling to her knees. "Who did this? What happened?" Tommy sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. "I owe them, Sarah. I owe them so much. 50 grand. They said if I don't have it by Friday, they're going to put me in an oil drum and drop me in the aqueduct." "Who? Tommy? Who do you owe?" Tommy looked up, his good eye wide with absolute terror. "The Angels, Sarah. The Hells Angels. Jackson Cole's crew. They hold my markers. They found out you and Jackson were close. They said if I don't pay, they're going to use you to get the money out of me." Sarah's blood ran cold. The grey eyes that had looked at her with such tenderness just hours ago suddenly flashed in her mind, twisted and sinister. "I owe you one, Sarah Hayes. Was it all a setup? Was Jackson getting close to her, just to keep an eye on Tommy's debt?" "I'll fix this," Sarah whispered, pulling her trembling brother into her arms. "I swear to God, Tommy, I won't let them touch you." The next 24 hours were a blur of panic and paranoia. Sarah couldn't reach Jackson. His phone went straight to voicemail. The silence was deafening, a confirmation in her mind that Tommy was telling the truth. Jackson had pulled back. The club was making its move. As she left the hospital on Thursday evening, the rain coming down in thick, blinding sheets, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside her in the parking structure. The back window rolled down, revealing a clean-cut man in a cheap grey suit. "Sarah Hayes," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Get in, unless you want your brother to be fish food by tomorrow morning." Terrified, Sarah climbed into the back seat. The doors locked with a heavy thud. "I'm Special Agent William Reed, FBI," the man said, flashing a gold shield. "We've been monitoring the Bakersfield charter of the Hells Angels for 2 years. RICO case, extortion, arms trafficking, narcotics, and now it seems your brother Tommy has found his way onto their hit list." "Tommy owes them money," Sarah said, her voice shaking. 50,000. Agent Reed chuckled darkly. 50,000. Sarah, Tommy owes them $250,000. He lost a massive shipment of methamphetamine he was supposed to transport for them. Jackson Cole himself signed the order for Tommy's execution this morning. We intercepted the chatter. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "Jackson? No. Jackson wouldn't do that. Jackson Cole is a ruthless killer who uses women like you for cover," Reed snapped, his voice turning hard. "He's playing you, and tomorrow night, while you're working your shift, his sergeant-at-arms is going to put 2 bullets in the back of Tommy's head." "How do I stop it?" Sarah pleaded, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "Please, I'll do anything." Agent Reed reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black USB drive and a microscopic adhesive microphone. "Tonight, Jackson is hosting a private church meeting at the clubhouse. The inner circle. All their ledgers, their payout routes, the evidence we need to bury them forever, is kept on an offline laptop in Jackson's private office behind the bar. I need you to go to him. Tell him you want to see him. Use your connection. While he's asleep, plug this drive into the laptop. It takes exactly 3 minutes to clone the hard drive. Plant the bug under his desk. We move in tomorrow at dawn. We arrest Jackson, we dismantle the club, and we put Tommy in witness protection. And if I don't, then I suggest you buy a nice black dress for a closed casket funeral," Reed said coldly. That night, Sarah drove to the heavily fortified compound on the outskirts of town. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The towering chain-link gates swung open when the prospect on guard recognized her car. Jackson was sitting at the massive oak bar in the dimly lit clubhouse, swirling a glass of amber whiskey. The place was empty, the meeting already concluded. When he saw her, his guarded expression softened into that rare, genuine smile he reserved only for her. "Sarah," he said, standing up and closing the distance between them. He wrapped his massive arms around her, smelling of smoke and leather. "I missed you. Been a hell of a week. Club business. Ordering her brother's murder." She forced herself to kiss him, tasting the whiskey on his tongue. She let him lead her to his private quarters in the back of the clubhouse. Every touch, every whispered word from him felt like 1,000 needles in her skin. She played her part perfectly, letting the illusion of their romance mask her desperate, trembling terror. Hours later, when the steady, heavy rhythm of Jackson's breathing signaled he was in a deep sleep, Sarah slipped out from under his heavy arm. She pulled on her oversized sweater, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She crept into his office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of a street lamp outside. She found the laptop on his heavy mahogany desk. Her hands shook violently as she booted it up. It bypassed a password screen, just as Reed had promised, and she jammed the black USB drive into the port. A small progress bar appeared. Cloning, 1 minute. The floorboards creaked in the hallway. Sarah stopped breathing, flattening herself against the desk. Nothing. Just the settling of the old building. 2 minutes. She peeled the backing off the microscopic microphone and stuck it underneath the lip of the desk, right where Jackson sat. 3 minutes. The screen flashed. Transfer complete. Sarah pulled the drive, shut the laptop, and crept back into bed. Jackson shifted, pulling her against his broad, scarred chest, pressing a soft kiss to the back of her neck in his sleep. A single tear rolled down Sarah's cheek, soaking into the pillow. She had just sold him for 30 pieces of silver. The raid happened at 5 a.m. It wasn't a quiet arrest. It was a tactical assault. Flashbangs shattered the windows of the clubhouse, turning the early morning darkness into a blinding, deafening hellscape. Heavily armored SWAT teams breached the front and back doors simultaneously, screaming orders over the wail of sirens. Jackson moved with terrifying speed. Before Sarah could even process the noise, he had thrown her to the floor, covering her body with his own. shielding her from the flying glass and potential crossfire. He had a Glock in his hand in a fraction of a second, aiming at the splintering door. "Jackson, drop the weapon," a voice boomed over a bullhorn. "FBI, put it down." Jackson froze. He looked at the laser sights dancing across his chest. Then he looked down at Sarah. She was crying hysterically, pulling the covers up to her chin, unable to meet his eyes. Slowly, the realization washed over his face. The raid, the precision, the fact that the feds knew exactly which room to hit first. He looked at his desk in the adjoining room, the drawer slightly ajar from where she had bumped it in her haste. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. Jackson slowly lowered the gun, placed it on the floor, and put his hands behind his head. As the SWAT officers rushed in, slamming him against the wall and violently ratcheting zip ties around his wrists, Jackson kept his grey eyes locked onto Sarah. There was no anger in his stare, no fury, just a profound, devastating heartbreak that shattered Sarah's soul into a million jagged pieces. "I'm sorry," she mouthed silently, tears streaming down her face as an officer pulled her to her feet and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "I had to save him." Jackson was hauled out into the flashing red and blue lights of the California morning. Sarah was escorted to a waiting unmarked car. Agent Reed was leaning against the hood, a triumphant smirk on his face. He took the USB drive from her shaking hand. "You did good, Sarah. You saved Tommy's life," Reed said, unlocking the car door for her. "We're taking you to the safe house. Tommy is already there." Sarah collapsed into the passenger seat, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably for the man she had just destroyed. But as the car pulled away from the ruined clubhouse, leaving Jackson Cole's life in ashes, Sarah Hayes had no idea that the real nightmare hadn't even begun. The truth was waiting for her at the safe house, and it was going to destroy her. The unmarked sedan tore through the desolate stretches of Highway 58, leaving the neon glow of Bakersfield far behind. The rain had stopped, replaced by a suffocating, dense morning fog that clung to the asphalt like a shroud. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her body trembling with a cold that radiated from her bones. The image of Jackson Cole, the way he had shielded her with his own body before surrendering to the tactical team, burned behind her eyelids. Agent William Reed turned the steering wheel sharply, navigating the car down a cracked, unpaved driveway, hidden behind a grove of dead Joshua trees. At the end of the dirt road sat a dilapidated, single-story stucco ranch house, the supposed FBI safe house. "We're here," Reed said, his voice unusually flat, devoid of the authoritative urgency he had carried all night. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt with shaking hands. "Is Tommy inside? Is he safe?" Reed didn't answer. He simply cut the engine, stepped out of the vehicle, and gestured for her to follow. The heavy silence of the Mojave Desert felt oppressive. As they approached the peeling front door, Reed didn't bother with standard protocol. He didn't draw his weapon or check the perimeter. He just turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. Sarah rushed inside, desperate to see her brother, desperate to know that the unimaginable price she had just paid was worth it. The living room was sparsely furnished. A single bare bulb illuminated the space. Sitting at a cheap fold-out card table in the center of the room was Tommy. There was a half-empty bottle of expensive bourbon in front of him, and he was casually tossing a set of keys in the air. Sarah froze. Tommy turned to look at her. The heavy purple bruises that had covered his face just 2 days ago were completely gone. His left eye, which had been swollen shut, was perfectly fine. He was wearing a crisp, expensive linen shirt and a gold watch that caught the harsh overhead light. He looked healthy, relaxed, and entirely unbothered.
"Tommy,"
Sarah whispered, the word catching in her throat.
"Your face. You were beaten. They were going to kill you."
Tommy offered a thin, uncomfortable smile. "Theatrical makeup is a hell of a thing, sis. I had a buddy from the community college theater department help me out. Sorry about the scare." The room began to spin. Sarah took a staggering step back, her mind violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of her. "What are you talking about? The 50,000. The Hells Angels. The hit Jackson put on you." Agent Reed chuckled from the doorway. It was a dark, venomous sound. He walked into the room, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite Tommy. He tossed the black USB drive Sarah had given him onto the table. "Jackson Cole never put a hit on your brother, Sarah," Reed said smoothly, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. "In fact, Jackson runs that charter by the book. The old rules laid down by the legendary Sonny Barger back in the Oakland days. Jackson was heavily against moving the kind of narcotics Tommy was pushing. Jackson wanted Tommy out of the city alive, just to keep the heat off the club." Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. "If Jackson wasn't trying to kill you, then who were you running from?" "I wasn't running from anyone," Tommy said, his voice hardening, losing the pathetic, victimized tone he always used with her. "I was running with the money. $2 million in untraceable club crypto sitting on an offline ledger in Jackson's office. I couldn't get into the clubhouse to get the drive. But you, the beautiful, naive ER nurse who had the big, bad outlaw eating out of the palm of her hand, you had unrestricted access to his bedroom." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow to the stomach. She dropped to her knees on the dusty hardwood floor. "I owe you one, Sarah Hayes." Jackson hadn't been manipulating her. He had been trying to protect her from her own brother. When Jackson figured out Tommy was embezzling and dealing with corrupt federal agents, he kept Sarah close so Tommy couldn't use her as leverage. "You're not FBI," Sarah gasped, looking up at Reed. "Oh, I am," Reed smiled, holding up his badge. "But a government salary doesn't buy beachfront property in Belize. Tommy and I made a deal. I use my strike team to orchestrate a raid, take Jackson off the board, and you deliver the keys to the kingdom. We split the $2 million.
"You used me,"
Sarah sobbed, glaring at her brother with absolute, unadulterated hatred. "I destroyed an innocent man for you. Grow up, Sarah. He's a Hell's Angel, not a saint," Tommy sneered. He reached for the black USB drive. "Now give me the laptop, Reed. Let's make the transfer and get out of this dust bowl." Reed didn't move. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "About that, Tommy. We have a slight change of plans." Before Tommy could register the shift in the agent's tone, Reed drew a suppressed 9mm pistol from his shoulder holster. Pfft! Pfft! 2 dull, metallic coughs echoed in the small room. Tommy's eyes went wide with shock. A dark red stain instantly bloomed across the chest of his crisp linen shirt. He collapsed forward, his forehead slamming against the card table, knocking the bourbon bottle to the floor, where it shattered into jagged pieces. Sarah screamed, scrambling backward against the wall. Reed calmly stood up, stepping over the puddle of spreading alcohol and blood. He picked up the USB drive and slid it into his pocket. Then he turned the suppressed weapon toward Sarah. "Sorry, sweetheart," Reed said, his eyes dead and unfeeling. "No loose ends." Sarah closed her eyes, squeezing them shut as tightly as she could. She didn't pray for a miracle. She only hoped it would be fast. She deserved it. She had betrayed Jackson. She had walked blindly into the devil's trap, and this was the Reaper coming to collect his due. But the gunshot never came. Instead, the deafening roar of a heavy engine shattered the desert silence, followed instantly by the explosive shattering of the safehouse's front window. A massive black Ford F250 smashed straight through the living room wall, tearing down the drywall and wooden studs in a cloud of blinding dust and debris. Reed was thrown violently backward, his pistol flying from his grip as the truck's heavy steel pushbar clipped his shoulder. Sarah covered her head, coughing as thick plaster dust filled the air. Through the haze, the doors of the pickup truck kicked open. 3 men in heavy leather vests stepped out into the ruined living room, assault rifles raised. At the front was Dutch, Jackson's sergeant at arms. The massive, heavily bearded biker looked like an angel of death emerging from the smoke. "Nobody moves!" Dutch roared, scanning the room. Reed, clutching his shattered shoulder, scrambled across the debris, desperately reaching for his dropped weapon. He didn't make it halfway. Dutch raised his rifle and fired a short, deafening burst. The corrupt agent went completely still, collapsing beside the rubble of the destroyed wall. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Sarah's ears. She looked at Tommy's lifeless body, then at Reed, and finally up at the towering figures of the Hells Angels. She waited for Dutch to turn his weapon on her. She had stolen their money. She had sent their president to federal prison. Dutch walked slowly over to her. He knelt in the debris, his expression unreadable behind his thick beard. He reached into his leather cut and pulled out a small encrypted burner phone. He handed it to her. "How?" Sarah choked out, her voice raw. "How did you find us?" "Jackson ain't stupid, Sarah," Dutch grumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "He knew Tommy was running a game with a dirty Fed. He just didn't know you were in on it until he saw you plug that drive in. But the drive you took wasn't the crypto ledger. Jackson swapped it weeks ago. The drive you handed to Reed was a GPS beacon and a Trojan horse. The second Reed plugged it into a terminal, we tracked the ping." Sarah stared at the phone in her hands. "Jackson let himself be arrested?" "He bought us time to get to you before Reed tied up his loose ends," Dutch said, standing up and racking his rifle. "He took the fall to keep you breathing." The weight of Jackson's sacrifice crashed down on her. She had betrayed him, and in return, he had laid down his freedom to save her life. "What happens to him now?" she asked, tears cutting tracks through the plaster dust on her face. "Federal lockup. The raid still turned up enough unregistered hardware to put him away for 5 to 10 years, Dutch said coldly. He turned toward the truck. "You need to disappear, Sarah. Jackson said you're off limits to the club, but that doesn't mean I want to look at your face ever again. You take that phone. There's an account with enough cash to get you out of California. If you ever come back, my mercy runs out." Dutch and the 2 brothers climbed back into the ruined truck, threw it into reverse, and tore out of the house, disappearing into the desert fog. 3 years later, the heavy metal doors of USP Victorville, a high-security federal penitentiary, clanged shut with a sickening finality. Sarah sat in the sterile visiting room, the bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back tightly. The naive ER nurse was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of betrayal and survival. The door on the inmate's side opened. Jackson walked in, clad in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to a waist chain. His grey eyes locked onto hers immediately. Despite the prison wear, he still carried himself like a king among men. He sat down across from her, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. Sarah mirrored his movement, pressing the plastic to her ear. "You shouldn't have come, Sarah." Jackson's gravelly voice came through the line, sending a familiar, painful shiver down her spine. "I had to," she replied, pressing her hand against the thick, smudged plexiglass separating them. "I needed you to know that I'm waiting, for as long as it takes." Jackson looked at her hand, slowly raising his own chained hand to press against the glass opposite hers. A slow, dangerous smile, the one she had fallen in love with all those years ago, spread across his face. "I make my own luck, darling," he murmured. "I'll be seeing you soon." What a tragic end to a tale of blood and betrayal. But the story doesn't stop here. This intense chapter is just one piece of our upcoming, massive 9-part historical drama saga, spanning nearly 10,000 words of gripping, real-life, underworld chronicles. You won't want to miss a single twist as we dive deeper into the shadows. If you were captivated by Sarah's impossible choice, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel right now. She stared at the cash register. A crumpled 20, a 10, and 3 damp singles. $33. The exact price of her survival. She handed it all to a soaked, stranded stranger. 2 days later, the deafening roar of 100 Hell's Angels shattered the town's silence, seeking her. The cracked neon sign outside Maggie's Route 41 diner had been buzzing like a dying wasp for 3 years. Nestled on the dusty outskirts of coarse gold, California, the diner was a relic of a bygone era, much like Maggie O'Connor herself. At 64, Maggie's hands were scarred from decades of hot grease and harsh bleach, her shoulders bowed under the weight of a life that refused to cut her a single break. It was a Tuesday evening, and the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the drought-stricken California dirt into a slick, treacherous mud. Inside, the diner was dead. The coffee in the pot had turned to bitter sludge, and the silence was only broken by the rhythmic, wheezing breaths of her 7-year-old grandson Toby, who was asleep in the corner booth with his head resting on a dog-eared math workbook. Maggie stood behind the counter, staring into the open drawer of the cash register. Inside lay a single, torn $20 bill, held together by yellowing Scotch tape, a crisp 10, and 3 damp ones. $33. That was her entire net worth. It was the only thing standing between her and total ruin. Tomorrow morning, Richard Coburn, the ruthless property manager who had spent the last 8 months buying up every struggling business on the highway for a corporate truck stop developer, was coming to collect. She was exactly $33 short of the minimum partial payment required to stop the foreclosure of the diner, and the attached trailer she and Toby called home. Maggie closed her eyes, fighting the familiar burn of tears. She had lost her husband, Bill, to a sudden heart attack 5 years ago. 2 years later, her daughter was taken by a reckless drunk driver, leaving Toby in Maggie's care. She had fought tooth and nail to keep the diner afloat, flipping burgers and pouring coffee for truckers who were becoming increasingly scarce. But the town was dying, and Richard Coburn was the vulture circling its remains. The sharp jingle of the front doorbell snapped her eyes open. A gust of freezing rain blew into the diner, rattling the napkin dispensers. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been spat out by the storm itself. He was colossal, easily 6'4", with a thick, rain-soaked beard and eyes as hard as flint. He wore heavy leather boots, denim stained with motor oil, and a thick leather vest. Even in the dim light, Maggie could see the unmistakable red and white patches on his chest and back. Hell's Angels. In a small town like Coarsegold, the name alone usually made people cross the street and lock their doors. But Maggie didn't flinch. She just saw a man shivering, water pooling at his boots, looking exhausted and beaten down by the elements. The giant of a man closed the door against the wind and took off his soaked leather gloves, wiping the water from his face. He looked around the empty diner, his gaze briefly lingering on the sleeping boy in the booth before meeting Maggie's eyes. "We're closed," Maggie said, her voice softer than she intended. "I know," the man rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in his chest. "I saw the sign go dark. I need to use your phone, ma'am, if you'll let me." Maggie grabbed a rag and wiped down the counter. "Phone's on the wall by the restrooms. Local calls are free. Long distance takes quarters." The biker let out a heavy sigh, his massive shoulders slumping. "That's the problem. I don't have quarters. I don't have anything." He walked slowly to the counter, taking a seat on one of the cracked vinyl stools. Up close, Maggie could see the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. Hit a patch of black ice and blown rubber about 2 miles back. Bike went down into the embankment. I lost my saddlebags, my wallet, my phone. Everything washed down the ravine in the mudslide. I've been walking for an hour. Maggie looked at him. He was a terrifying figure to most, an outlaw by society's standards. His knuckles were heavily tattooed, spelling out words she couldn't quite read in the shadows, but his hands were shaking from the biting cold. "Let me get you a cup of coffee," Maggie said, turning to a fresh pot she had just started brewing for herself. She poured a heavy ceramic mug full of the steaming black liquid and set it in front of him. "I told you I can't pay for it," he said, looking down at the mug as if it were a mirage. "I didn't ask for your money," Maggie replied, sliding a plate of leftover cherry pie toward him. "Eat. You look like you're going to pass out in my diner, and I don't have the strength to drag you outside." A faint ghost of a smile touched the biker's lips. "Thank you." He ate the pie in 3 massive bites and drained half the coffee, closing his eyes as the warmth hit his system. "My name is Clayton," he said, looking up at her. "Most people call me Bones." "I'm Maggie. That's Toby over there." Clayton nodded toward the boy. "He shouldn't be sleeping in a diner." "He's got asthma," Maggie said, her voice tightening defensively. "The trailer gets drafty in the rain, makes his chest tight. It's warmer in here by the ovens." Clayton's eyes softened, taking in the dilapidated state of the diner, the rusted fryers, the patched-up ceiling. He saw the desperation Maggie was trying so hard to hide. "I need to get to Fresno," Clayton said quietly. "My chapter. My brothers are down there. If I can just get to a payphone and get someone on the line, they'll come to get me. But the local tow company down the road, guy named Clyde, said he won't pull my bike out of the mud unless I hand him $30 cash up front. Says he doesn't trust my kind." Maggie's breath hitched. $30. She looked at the cash register. Inside was the $33, the exact amount she needed to hand Richard Coburn in the morning to buy herself a 2-week extension on her eviction. If she didn't have it, Coburn would lock the doors by noon. "If my bike sits in that mud all night, the engine will flood completely. It's custom," Clayton said, his voice laced with a quiet desperation that felt painfully familiar to Maggie. "It's the only thing I own in this world." Maggie stared at the massive biker. She thought about her own life. She thought about Richard Coburn, his smug smile, his expensive suits, the way he looked at her, like she was dirt beneath his designer shoes. She knew that even if she gave Coburn the $33, it was only delaying the inevitable. He would find another way to force her out. The game was rigged against people like her. But right here, right now, She had the power to actually help someone. She had the power to save this man's livelihood. Without saying a word, Maggie walked over to the register. She hit the button. The drawer popped open with a sad ding. She reached in, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the drawer, and pulled out the crumpled 20, the 10, and the 3 damp singles. She walked back to the counter and placed the money in front of Clayton. Clayton froze, staring at the crumpled bills. "What is this?" "It's $33, Maggie said, her voice steady. "Clyde charges $30 for a winch out. Use the other 3 to buy a hot chocolate from his vending machine while you wait. He's a stubborn old mule, but if you wave cash in his face, he'll pull your bike out." Clayton didn't touch the money. He looked from the bills up to Maggie's weary eyes. "Maggie, I can't take this. I saw you staring at that register. That's all you have, isn't it?" "It doesn't matter what it is," Maggie lied, lifting her chin. "Consider it a loan. You can pay me back when you find your wallet." Clayton stood up slowly, towering over her. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand and gently picked up the money. He didn't say a word for a long time. He just looked at her, his dark eyes memorizing her face, the diner, the sleeping boy in the corner. "You're a good woman, Maggie O'Connor," Clayton said softly, reading her name tag. He carefully folded the bills and placed them in the inner pocket of his leather cut. "I won't forget this. The angels don't forget." He turned and walked out into the freezing rain, the bells jingling behind him. Maggie stood alone in the quiet diner. She walked over to the cash register and pushed the empty drawer shut. It sounded like a coffin closing. She had just given away her survival, her home, her grandson's security, to a complete stranger. She sank to the floor behind the counter, pulled her knees to her chest, and wept silently into the dark. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a harsh, unforgiving grey sky. At exactly 7 a.m., the low hum of the diner's ancient refrigerators choked, sputtered, and died. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once before plunging the room into shadows. Maggie, who hadn't slept a wink, was wiping down tables in the gloom. The power company had finally cut the cord. "Grandma, it's cold," Toby said, rubbing his eyes as he sat up in the booth, pulling his thin jacket tighter around his small frame. "I know, baby," Maggie said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Go pack your backpack. Put your favorite toys in there, okay? We're going to be taking a little trip today." She hadn't even finished the sentence when the crunch of tires on gravel echoed outside. A sleek, silver Mercedes pulled into the muddy lot, looking violently out of place in front of the rusted diner. Richard Coburn stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase and an umbrella that he held defensively against the light drizzle. 2 men flanked him, local sheriff's deputies looking deeply uncomfortable. Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach. She walked to the front door and unlocked it, stepping out onto the porch to meet them, blocking their view of Toby inside. "Morning, Maggie," Coburn said, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across his face. "I see the power company finally caught up with you. Saves me a call." "You're early, Richard," Maggie said, her jaw clenched. "The notice said I had until noon." "Yes, well, the paperwork also said you needed to produce a minimum payment of $33 by close of business yesterday to initiate the grace period," Coburn said, snapping his briefcase open. He pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. "My office received no such payment, so the grace period is void. The property belongs to Horizon Developments as of 8 a.m. "Richard, please," Maggie whispered, her pride shattering as the reality set in. "I have a grandson. It's raining. Just give me the weekend to clear out my things. I'll leave the fryers. I'll leave the furniture. Just let us stay in the trailer until Sunday." Coburn sighed, adjusting his expensive tie. "Maggie, it's not personal. It's progress. The demolition crews are scheduled for Monday morning. We need the site secured and fenced off by this afternoon. You have 2 hours to remove your personal belongings. The deputies will stay here to ensure nothing permanent goes missing." He stepped forward and ruthlessly slapped the red and white "Foreclosed" sign on the diner's front window, right over the fading letters of Maggie's name. 2 hours, Maggie," Coburn sneered. He turned on his heel, walked back to his Mercedes, and drove away, leaving her standing in the cold with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of ash. The next 2 hours were a blur of trauma. Maggie and Toby stuffed their entire lives into heavy-duty black garbage bags and cardboard boxes from the pantry. The deputies stood by silently. One of them, a young man Maggie had known since he was a teenager, looked like he was fighting back tears, but orders were orders. By 10:30 a.m., Maggie and Toby were sitting on an overturned milk crate at the edge of the property line, near the highway. Around them sat 4 garbage bags and 2 boxes. It was all they had left in the world. The rain had stopped, giving way to a heavy, suffocating humidity. The town of Coarsegold was waking up, and cars drove by. People Maggie had served coffee to for 30 years averted their eyes, driving faster when they saw her sitting there. The shame was suffocating. "Where are we going to sleep tonight, Grandma?" Toby asked, his voice trembling as he clutched a worn-out stuffed bear. "I don't know, baby," Maggie whispered, pulling him into her side. "But we're together. That's what matters." She looked down at her empty hands. She thought about Clayton. She wondered if he had made it to Fresno. She wondered if giving away that $33 was the stupidest thing she had ever done. It wouldn't have saved the diner. Coburn's presence this morning proved that, but it might have bought them a night in a cheap motel instead of the streets. No, she told herself, she couldn't regret kindness. If she let the world make her bitter, she truly had nothing left. Noon approached. The heat of the afternoon sun began to bake the damp asphalt. Richard Coburn returned, this time with a flatbed truck carrying chain-link fencing. He stepped out, directing the workers with arrogant waves of his hands. "Make sure the perimeter is tight," Coburn barked at the workers. He glanced over at Maggie and Toby, sitting by the road, a smirk playing on his lips. "I told you, Maggie, you need to vacate the frontage. You're loitering on private property now." Maggie didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs felt like lead. "Did you hear me?" Coburn snapped, marching toward her. "I will have the deputies arrest you for trespassing if you don't." He stopped. The ground beneath Maggie's feet began to vibrate. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to echo up from the very bedrock of the earth. Toby looked up, his eyes wide. "Grandma, is it an earthquake?" Maggie frowned, looking down the long, empty stretch of Highway 41. The vibrations grew stronger. The leftover puddles in the gravel parking lot began to ripple in tiny, concentric circles. Then the sound hit them. It was a deep, guttural roar, like thunder trapped in a canyon, growing louder and more ferocious by the second. Coburn's workers dropped their tools, turning to look down the highway. The 2 deputies stepped out of their cruiser, hands instinctively dropping to their belts. Over the crest of the hill, a mile down the road, a dark mass appeared. At first it looked like a black cloud rolling over the asphalt. But as it crested the hill, the sun caught the gleaming chrome of heavy exhaust pipes and polished handlebars. Motorcycles, not just a few. Dozens of them. Row after row of massive Harley-Davidsons, riding in perfect military-style formation. The deafening roar of their V-twin engines echoed off the pine trees, shaking the leaves from the branches. Leading the pack was a colossal, custom-built chopper, its extended forks glinting fiercely in the daylight. Coburn took a step back, his face draining of color. What is this?" he stammered, looking at the deputies, who were completely frozen in shock. The massive column of bikers didn't blow past the diner. As the lead rider approached the property line, he raised a single, black-gloved fist into the air. In perfect unison, 100 motorcycles downshifted, the explosive backfire sounding like heavy artillery. The riders turned their wheels, swarming into the muddy parking lot of Maggie's Route 41 diner. They parked in immaculate, staggered rows, effectively surrounding Coburn's silver Mercedes and the work trucks. The engines cut out one by one, leaving a sudden, ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. 100 men dismounted. They wore heavy leather boots, dark jeans, and vests adorned with the winged death head. The Hells Angels had arrived, and they brought the entire weight of their Brotherhood with them. The townsfolk who were driving by slammed on their brakes, causing a minor traffic jam on the highway. Shop owners across the street locked their doors and peered through the blinds in absolute terror. Richard Coburn was trembling, his arrogant posture completely collapsing as the sea of leather and denim parted. Walking down the center of the formation was the giant from the night before, Clayton Bones Miller. He wasn't covered in mud anymore. His leather cut was clean, his boots shined, and the patches on his chest gleamed with a terrifying authority. He didn't even look at Coburn. His dark, intense eyes were locked entirely on Maggie, who was still sitting on the milk crate, clutching Toby to her chest. Clayton walked slowly toward her, the gravel crunching under his boots, 100 of his brothers standing silently behind him, watching. "I told you, Maggie." Clayton's deep voice boomed through the dead silence of the lot. "The angels don't forget." Clayton stood before Maggie, his massive frame blocking out the harsh midday sun. He reached down, offering a scarred, calloused hand. Maggie stared at it for a second before placing her trembling fingers into his palm. He pulled her to her feet with shocking gentleness, then looked down at Toby, offering the boy a reassuring wink. You came back," Maggie breathed, still clutching her garbage bag, as if it were a shield. "I told you I would," Clayton rumbled. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out the exact same crumpled 20, 10, and 3 damp singles she had given him. He pressed them gently back into her hand. "I'm returning the loan. But my brothers and I felt the interest rate needed a little adjusting." "Now, see here." Richard Coburn's voice cracked, sounding like a panicked teenager as he tried to regain his authority. He stepped out from behind his silver Mercedes, brandishing his laminated foreclosure notice like a weapon. "This is private property. Horizon Developments owns this land, and you all are trespassing. Deputies, arrest them." The 2 deputies didn't move a muscle. One of them actually took a deliberate step backward, lowering his gaze to his boots. You didn't need to read the penal code to know that 2 badges and 2 sidearms meant absolutely nothing against 100 patched Hells Angels. Clayton slowly turned around to face Coburn. The sea of bikers parted, forming a tight, impenetrable wall around the property line. "You must be Richard Coburn," Clayton said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. He walked toward the developer, his heavy boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. "I had a nice long chat with the regional manager of the First National Bank of Fresno this morning. Seems he's a big fan of vintage motorcycles. We had coffee. Talked about you." Coburn's face went paper white. "The bank has nothing to do with this. The foreclosure is finalized. Not exactly, a voice called out. A tall, surprisingly clean-cut biker, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a secretary patch, stepped forward from the pack. His name was Sullivan, and beneath his leather cut, he was a ruthless corporate attorney who handled the club's legal affairs. Sullivan pulled a thick stack of manila folders from his saddlebag and tossed them onto the hood of Coburn's Mercedes. You see, Ricky, you were so eager to kick a widow out on the street over $33 that you violated Section 4 of the California Homeowner Bill of Rights. You didn't provide the mandatory 30-day written notice of default before initiating the seizure of the attached residential trailer, which means this foreclosure is illegal. Void. Coburn sputtered, his eyes darting frantically between the documents and the massive men surrounding him. That's a clerical error. I'll have my lawyers fix it by tomorrow. You won't have the chance, Clayton interrupted, stepping so close to Coburn that the developer flinched, shrinking back against his car. Clayton reached into his pocket and pulled out a certified cashier's check. He held it up to Coburn's face. My chapter pooled some funds this morning, Clayton said softly. We bought the diner's original debt outright from the bank, and we paid off the remaining mortgage on the property. Maggie doesn't owe the bank a dime, and she certainly doesn't owe you. Coburn stared at the check, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The realization washed over him. He had been completely outmaneuvered. Now, Clayton whispered, leaning in so close that Coburn could smell the motor oil and leather. You and your boys are going to pack up your little fence. You're going to get in your fancy car, and you are going to leave coarse gold. If I ever see your face near this diner again, I won't bring a lawyer. Do we understand each other? Coburn swallowed hard, terrified tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. He nodded furiously. Yes, absolutely. Get out, Clayton barked. The developer practically fell into his Mercedes. His workers scrambled into their trucks, abandoning half their tools in the mud, and peeled out of the parking lot, their tires spinning frantically on the wet asphalt. The two deputies gave Clayton a nervous, respectful nod before quietly slipping into their cruiser and driving away. The suffocating tension in the air vanished, replaced by the victorious roar of 100 bikers cheering and revving their engines. Maggie stood frozen, her mind unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The deed to the diner, and her home, was suddenly clear. She dropped to her knees in the gravel, burying her face in her hands as years of terror, grief, and exhaustion poured out in violent, shaking sobs. She felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. Clayton knelt beside her in the dirt, ignoring the mud ruining his jeans. It's over, Maggie, he said gently. You're safe. Why? Maggie choked out, looking up at him through her tears. It was just $33. Why would you do all of this for me? Clayton smiled, a genuine, warm expression that completely transformed his hardened face. Out on the road, survival isn't about how much money you have in the bank. It's about who is willing to stop and help you when you're broken down in the dark. You gave me everything you had when you had nothing left to give. That makes you family. And the angels take care of their family. He stood up and turned to the army of bikers. All right, brothers, Clayton roared, clapping his massive hands together. We've got a diner to fix. What happened next became a legend in the town of Coarse Gold. For the next 48 hours, the Hells Angels transformed from a terrifying motorcycle club into a fiercely loyal construction crew. Men who looked like they belonged in a maximum security prison were suddenly on their hands and knees, scrubbing the diner's floors with toothbrushes. A biker named Grizzly, who had a rap sheet longer than a highway, spent 6 hours rewiring the ancient electrical system. 2 men with heavily tattooed faces climbed onto the roof to patch the leaks, while a half-dozen others sanded down the rusty countertops and painted the walls a cheerful, vibrant yellow. Even Toby was brought into the fold. Clayton sat the boy on the leather seat of his custom chopper, placing a tiny, child-sized leather vest over Toby's shoulders. The boy's asthma seemed to vanish in the excitement, his laughter ringing out across the parking lot as the bikers taught him how to polish chrome. By Friday morning, Maggie's Route 41 diner didn't look like a failing relic. It looked like a masterpiece. The neon sign buzzed brightly, fully repaired. The kitchen gleamed, and most importantly, the parking lot was absolutely packed. The townsfolk, seeing that the notorious biker club had essentially adopted the diner, flocked to the grand reopening out of sheer curiosity and awe. The line for a booth stretched out the door. Maggie, wearing a brand-new apron the club had bought her, flew behind the counter, flipping burgers and pouring coffee with a joy she hadn't felt in a decade. Every Sunday, without fail, the deafening rumble of V-twin engines would echo down Highway 41. Dozens of Hell's Angels would pull into the lot, filling the booths, drinking black coffee, and leaving $100 tips under their plates. Maggie was never bothered by the bank, or a developer, or the local authorities ever again. She had an army of outlaws ensuring her peace. If you walk into Maggie's diner today, you'll see the gleaming fryers and the happy customers. But if you look behind the cash register, right above the coffee pots, you'll see a small wooden picture frame hanging on the wall. Inside the frame is a torn $20 bill, a crisp 10, and 3 slightly wrinkled singles. $33. A quiet, permanent reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters on the road are just guardian angels wearing leather. If Maggie's incredible story of karma, sacrifice, and the surprising humanity of outlaws touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with a friend to spread the message that kindness always comes back to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more gripping, true-to-life stories. What would you have done in Maggie's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.